In her book titled A Weary World, Reflections for a Blue Christmas, Pastor Kathy Escobar talks about how sometimes we have to borrow hope from each other. She wrote this book because her 20-year-old son died by suicide suddenly a few weeks before Christmas one year, with no warning signs of any kind. She writes, "In the middle of real life, real struggles, real loss, real crises of faith, and real humanity, it's easy to become weary, exhausted, and hopeless. Sometimes one of the only things that can sustain us comes from other people, or God, or an inspiration that helps us take the next breath, or the next steps, or make it through the next day." Hope means different things for people, but for a lot of us, it's some kind of expectation, a possibility that maybe things could be different, that there's more to life than what we can see, that there's something better ahead. Many of us, for all kinds of reasons, are afraid to hope. We've seen many of our dreams dashed, our jobs lost, our relationships crumble, our health deteriorate, addictions ravage, and God not delivering the goods the way we had hoped. Because of past experiences, we then hunker down in our hearts and do whatever we can to protect them against believing that good is actually possible. Often the thought of something more hurts too much. The thought of making ourselves vulnerable and getting hurt again is too risky. The what-ifs mount, hope gets held at bay, and we miss out on the thing Jesus kept pointing to over and over again in the Gospels: life now, love now, hope now, despite our circumstances. I'm constantly reminded that pretty much everything Jesus calls people to is quite dangerous. Why would hope be different? She asks. Hope, according to Escobar, requires risk and is nothing less than dangerous. At the last public meeting for the Community Commission for Public Safety and Accountability, which I am on, we held a hearing on officer wellness. You may not be aware of this, but the Chicago Police Department has one of the highest rates of suicide for officers in the country. You also may not know that all police officers across the country have a greater chance of committing suicide than the average person who is not an officer. For the hearing, we heard from a woman in our community who lost first her brother, who was an active duty CPD officer, and then her father, who was a retired CPD officer, to suicide. We heard from a police officer who works in the 11th Police District, who talked about the horrible things he sees when he walks into the district building before he even leaves to go out on patrol to see more horrible things. He said a district building is supposed to be the place where you can come home to rejuvenate before going out on the street again, and instead it's a place of hopelessness. He described ceilings crumbling and leaking water, and he said some of the leaking water actually has human waste in it. He described human feces in the parking lot and a crater so large that officers joke amongst themselves that one day someone's going to drive into it and not be found for months. He said so many things don't work in the building or are falling apart, and he's been trying for 7 years, the 7 years that he's been there, to get things fixed. but he can't get anyone in CPD or the Office of Asset Management to say who owns the building and who is responsible for repairs. Apparently, there are other districts in bad shape as well. And his comments had nothing to do with migrants living in the police districts. He took us back 7 years to when he began and detailed all of the disgusting things about the building from 7 years ago. We also heard from the CPD superintendent, from an expert who spent 45 years in the Los Angeles Police Department and is someone with whom our commission has consulted, especially around best practices. And we heard from Alexa James, who is the CEO of NAMI Chicago, which is one of the leading organizations on addressing mental health. Someone from the audience asked a question about why the suicide rate might be increasing for Chicago Police Department officers. Alexa talked about the fact that as a culture, we are in the midst of what is being called a loneliness epidemic. And then she said that there seems to be a common element with those who take their lives. At some point, they seem to give up all hope of anything changing or improving or getting better. She said, most of us can't imagine that kind of hopelessness because we tend to have a very specific realm of it, or we go in and out of it. Once someone climbs into that deep hole, it's difficult to get out of it. She referred to the officer who had talked about the building issues, adding to a sense of hopelessness for officers. She said if she had to work in a place where human waste was coming out of pipes in the ceiling, and if she had tried for 7 years to get someone there to fix it, she might begin to suffer from hopelessness too. How does anyone hold on to hope when the circumstances of our lives look completely hopeless? In the Hebrew Scriptures, one of the books that delves into hope is the book of Job. The story of Job is that God and Satan were having a chat one day and made a bet. And because of the bet, God let Satan take everything and every person that mattered to Job away from him through death. The whole idea, what the bet was based on, was whether or not Job would remain faithful to God if he had nothing. In various parts of the story, Job loses all hope. Who wouldn't? What's interesting, though, is that in the midst of losing all hope about his life, Job remains faithful to God and will not curse God. Fortunately, it's not a true or historical story and is much more of an allegory to consider theodicy or the theology of good and evil and suffering. I don't know about you, but I find it profoundly disturbing on many levels and always have. And I am also intrigued by the fact that Job can lose hope and still believe in God. When Job's family had all died, when he lost every penny he had ever made, and then when he was very ill to the point of death, he gave up hope. He knew at a visceral level that his family was not coming back to life. While he might gain some wealth back, he would never again be as successful. And he couldn't imagine that he would ever feel as good as he did before he was stricken with such horrible illnesses. Some would say Job was a realist. He knew that there was no going back to the before time. He had no hope that he would go back there. And yet, he still had some sense that even though God seemed more and more absent, because every time Job cried, God did not respond, Job knew that God would ultimately not abandon him. He claimed at one point that he knew his Redeemer still lived. God was not dead. I think it's important for us to understand that holding on to hope does not mean engaging in self-deception or wishful thinking or even numbing ourselves to our own lives. We might all have times when we have given up hope about someone or something specific, but we might still believe that God or our higher power or the energy of the universe is headed in the right direction and will continue to hold us in some way. The character of Job was as faithful as anyone could be, and even he lost hope in his life circumstances. In the Christian scriptures, particularly in the stories surrounding the birth of Jesus, we see examples of people who feel hopeless to some extent. In our text in Luke, it's Zechariah and Elizabeth. Zechariah is a priest, and he and Elizabeth are both old and childless because Elizabeth was unable to get pregnant, according to the text. Zechariah is on duty for lighting incense in the inner chamber of the temple, and when he goes in to do that, an angel of God appears to him and scares him half to death. The angel then tells him, after he's been scared half to death, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, because your prayers have been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear a son, and you are to name him John." The angel goes on to say what a great man John will grow to be. Zechariah, understandably, asks the angel how he can be sure of this since he and Elizabeth are both so old. The angel said, "I am Gabriel. I stand in God's presence. I was sent to you to speak to you and to bring this good news to you." And then the angel tells him that because he doubted, he will be made mute until the baby is born. By the end of our text, Elizabeth is pregnant. Most of us love these stories that lead up to Jesus being born in Bethlehem, and I know that I, for one, especially love the role of the angels in these stories. And I also know that this story is a really hard one for couples who have tried to get pregnant and can't. To say that Zechariah's prayer has been answered feels to many as if it means their own prayers didn't get answered because they never were able to have children. It also makes it sound as if God is the one who decides who gets to give birth and who doesn't. I want you to think about that for a minute. I think we all know, based on the fathers and mothers convicted of murdering their children or horribly abusing them, that if God were deciding who gets to have kids and who doesn't, the choosing would be much more careful and kids would not be harmed. What's interesting about our story this morning is that it doesn't say Zechariah and Elizabeth were still praying to have kids. It just says they were still being faithful to God. It's reasonable to assume they had given up all hope for ever having a child. Have you ever lost hope of ever having something happen that you once wanted? I have. The hopes I have given up on in my lifetime have ranged from small and potentially hilarious to gigantic. I really wanted to play football, and I don't mean I don't mean flag football, I mean football with a helmet and pads when I was in high school. And I was not allowed, and I had to give up the hope of ever doing so. I stuck with powder puff instead, but it wasn't the same. At the other end of the spectrum, I really wanted my mom to get sober and stay sober. And after years of hoping with all of my heart, I had to give up that hope. She did eventually get sober, but she never stayed sober. And that's the kind of range we have from small hopes to gigantic hopes. Most, if not all of us, have that same kind of range in the hopes we've given up over time. What I find to be one of the most complicated aspects of hope is how we imagine God's involvement in the thing for which we are hoping. We're often told that if something doesn't happen the way we want it to, it has something to do with our lack of belief. We can pray and pray for something, but if it doesn't happen, it could be because we simply didn't believe enough. We forget how most of the things we are hoping for require us or someone else to actually do something. We can't make someone else do something or want something or feel something, so we can only focus on our own actions. In Al-Anon, we call that staying on our side of the street. Wouldn't hope be much easier if we could cross everybody's streets and control other people? Or at least change their minds about things? Over time, I've shared with you the image that one of my favorite theology professors shared. Though he died a few years ago, Dr. Terence Fretheim, a Hebrew scripture scholar, was a visiting professor at Princeton when I was in seminary, and he taught a class called God and Human Suffering. So much of what he taught resonated with me because he began the class by saying, just because I believe this and am teaching it now doesn't mean I won't believe something completely different 5 years from now, so don't hold me to it. I loved that beginning. Dr. Fretheim talked about the relationship between God and we humans and said that God depends on us to partner with God in the work of love and healing and peace building and justice. We tend to want to shove it all off onto God and forget that we are conduits of God's actions in the world. The image he shared in one of our classes was of an old 2- or 3-story house on a busy street, which for those of us in Princeton wasn't hard to imagine. It's also not hard here in Chicago. Think of a 2- or 3-story old house and bring it into your mind. Fretheim had us picture God sitting in the window frame, legs dangling, looking intently at the street below with people bustling on by. God's role, according to Fretheim, was to get the attention of all of us who are walking, bustling, talking, planning, worrying on by below. And to not stop in that effort of getting our attention. Once God is able to get our attention, the partnering or co-creating can happen. Our job then, as we walk the various streets of our lives, is to pay attention to where and when and how and through whom God might be trying to get our attention. While it may not be a perfect image, it is one that still resonates to this day with me. How will we pay attention as we work on living with fear and holding on to hope? We've all had those moments where we've thought, oh, if only I had listened to that voice inside. Well, that voice inside is not always just your voice. In any conversation about hope, it's important to state out loud that hope is not a requirement for a spiritual life. In the letter to the church at Corinth, the Apostle Paul said that of faith and hope and love, the greatest one of those three is love. If you are someone who has had to give up hope regarding a person or a thing, or even regarding God, that doesn't mean you can't still have a spiritual life. Let's remember, though, that in addition to being a spiritual person, in addition to being spiritual people, we are also a spiritual community. We talk about personal hope, and communal hope is every bit as important. When Pastor Kathy Escobar talks about borrowing hope, she is identifying the wide and deep river source of communal hope. When a parent loses a child, the devastation is as all-encompassing as it can be. What greater loss could there be? There is no chance for hope ever again related to that child, other than that maybe there is a heaven, and maybe someday there will be a reuniting. For most parents I know, that brings little to no solace. Those of us who have not been parents or who have not lost children have to be careful about how we talk about and imagine hope for those who have been devastated in ways that we cannot imagine. Communal hope is focused on our connections, our relationships, systems, and structures outside of our personal spheres. We look at how we move and live in the world and with whom we are doing kingdom building. We consider progress made and progress yet to be made, and we ask how we will be a part of what is being built or created or recreated. The movie Harriet is out on streaming services now, and Harriet Tubman's story is one of communal hope. Once enslaved people could live freely in the North, there was hope that if one could escape and make their way north, they could be free. It took a whole network of incredibly courageous people to bring that hope to fruition. Hope is not just a feeling, but it's imagining how things can and need to be different, and then working together to make that vision a reality. Wanting to end poverty and homelessness is holding on to a vision where every person can thrive, and then working to make it happen. Some would say it's unrealistic, but if you consider the wealth in the world, it's not. It's a matter of redistribution and reparations as beginning places. If you are someone who has been feeling hopeless lately, Pastor Kathy Escobar has some suggestions for you. First, admit what you are really afraid of. Second, seek courage in the small steps. This one has to do with the incredibly high expectations we put on ourselves and focusing on how it's usually a series of small steps that keeps hope alive. It's focusing on today and what can be done today. And then tomorrow it's focusing on that day and on what can be done. Third, expect hope to hurt. It's not always going to go the way we want it to. Fourth, realize that hope in circumstances is not reliable. I think the 2016 election might be an example of that. When we're focused just on the circumstances, our hope is not reliable. Fifth, strain to feel God, see God, hear God wherever we can. Hope is dangerous because it taps into our vulnerability. When my mom went through rehab and got sober, I had the highest hopes I have ever had, and 6 weeks later, she began drinking again. After I miscarried my first child, I remember how difficult it was to hope that I would get pregnant again and that I would be able to carry a child to term. To say that hope taps into our deepest vulnerabilities is accurate. I and so many others can also say, I was never alone in those vulnerabilities because we have a God who became vulnerable in the form of an infant to live in this world, to share in our vulnerability. If we allow it, Jesus can be a good companion in our brokenheartedness, whatever the cause. We haven't said everything that needs to be said or resolved everything about hope today because it's bigger than us and bigger than the 20 minutes we've had. While hope is not a requirement for a spiritual life, it is necessary for the communal work of justice with love. Hope is the thing that beckons us forward in our life together as a congregation and in our networks of justice around the city. Hope is why I will continue to stand with my friends and colleagues to demand work permits for all. Hope is why we continue to offer housing to asylum seekers. One of our families moved out on Friday into their own apartment after living with us for a year. Hope is why we will get involved in the 2024 presidential election. Hope is why we continue to work to end gun violence. Hope is why we continue to call for an end to war and terrorism in all forms. Hope is why we consider each week how we want to offer ourselves in the world in the coming week. Every one of us can only do so much. We each have limits on our time, energy, imagination, and even our love. We have financial limits. We have areas that are too close for comfort. I've never worked in a rehab center because it's a little too close for comfort for me. I can do other things instead. Not all of the things are ours to do. As a white, queer Christian pastor, I'm a part of many communities. Part of my work is to get clear about what I am to do and what others are to do, and then maintaining some boundaries. And that is your work too. Part of communal hope is being a good team player and knowing when to let others lead and when to step up into leadership. It's being able to identify the various privileges we have and knowing how and when to use them or not. Choosing communities in which we are able to be our full selves is an important part of this. Can we be honest and authentic? Can we rely on others? Can we fall apart and be held? Can we be pushed when necessary and given rest when necessary? There is much to be afraid of currently. We would be lying if we were to say otherwise. One of the ways we can live with our fear and not let it control our lives is by holding on to hope. And sometimes that means joining hands with others and borrowing it for a little while. May this Advent season be one in which we all strain to see, hear, and feel God. Amen.